In the ancient church of Saint Eulalie in the city of Bordeaux in southern France, miracles sometimes happen. During a service attended by hundreds of the faithful, an image of Christ appeared on a wafer used in the Catholic Mass. As the priest and the worshippers looked on in stunned silence, the face of Jesus remained on the host for more than 20 minutes. A voice emanating from the small disc delivered a message, apparently referring to the priest. Witnesses to the miracle of 1820 say the voice belonged to Jesus and he spoke these 5 words, "I am, who, he, is." The account that follows may or may not represent a miracle of a different sort. After you hear the facts of the case, feel free to make the determination for yourself. The story takes place in 2020 or perhaps 1920. Then again, it may have occurred in 1820 shortly after he said "I am who he is." The time is irrelevant, for there is no time in this narrative. The story starts at midnight and it finishes some hours later at the same point in time, midnight, the exact time it started. Though the narrative is set in a city where 250,000 people make their homes, it actually takes place in a little village on the fringe of Bordeaux. It is a place of such minor import that it has no name other than the little village on the edge of town. The residents of the township were of even less import than the dreary hamlet. Least significant of all was the much derided and disrespected old maid named Mademoiselle Marie Chabot. Thin as a broomstick, her arms and legs were overrun with snaky blue veins, protruding from parchment skin. People taunted the ancient lady and called her a witch for her hawkish nose, and the string-like white hair that ran from the top of her head all the way to her toes, where it mingled with the dirt of the streets and began to gather filth in the same manner as a single flake of snow becomes a snowball. She lived in the turret at the top of an antiquated maison de briques, a house made of bricks, at the end of La Rue Solitaire, Lonely Street. When the sun managed to pierce the thick glass of the single window in her turret, which it did for 8 to 10 hours most days, she worked diligently at making her intricate lace creations. Handcrafted lace items from France were known throughout the world, for their quality and beauty. Laugh at her though they did, the merchants of Bordeaux nonetheless paid her well for her work, which today would be highly sought after, and sold to collectors for many thousands of dollars. Working with thin, delicate strands, sometimes it took months for the old woman to create a single example of her craft. Though she received reasonable reimbursement, her low output meant that times could be lean between paydays. In the village, no one knew if she had relatives. They knew she had no friends, and her only acquaintances other than the priests were the lace merchants to whom she sold her wares, and the landlord of her building. It was said that as a young girl, she had been engaged to be married to handsome Georges Chassot, a knight of the French Legion of Honor. It was speculated by all who knew him, that the young chevalier was sure to be promoted to the next rank in the Legion, that of officer. Though the townspeople talked about it, they found it hard to believe that the withered old beldame could ever have held the interest of a knight of the Legion, for anything more than a drunken nocturnal encounter after a battle. Still, there were a very few mind you, who said they were able to see vestiges of beauty under the wrinkles and the degraded face, which seemed to be little more than a mask made of paper. Giving some weight to the theory that she may indeed have been betrothed to the knight Chassot, was a ring she wore on her 4th finger, left hand. It was thought at the time, that the little finger had a vein leading directly to the heart. It was called la veine de l'amour, the vein of love. A tiny band of gold, the ring was shaped into 2 miniature hands clasped together, signifying the engagement of the wearer. Old Marie Chabot had few comforts in life. The crafting of the lace was a source of pride, but certainly not comfort. The work was long and tedious. It pained her fingers and eyes, as well as putting a strain on her neck and her back. Her abode, a damp and draughty sphere, in a turret with walls of coarse stone, inside and out, certainly gave her no ease and only a fitful rest during the cold nights. Tranquility and satisfaction came to her only when she was in the Church of Miracles, La Église de Saint Eulalie. She attended services every day of the year, even in winter when she had to plod through the snow. Her spindly legs barely supported her during the hour it took to make the half-mile trek from the turret to the communion rail at the 6 a.m. Mass. Less than a week before Christmas, Marie Chabot woke to the peal of the bells of Saint Eulalie. Peering through the solitary window in the tower, she saw only darkness. No stars, no street lamps. She was unable to distinguish even the walls of the other buildings in the Rue Solitaire, Lonely Street. She assumed the bells were calling her to the morning service at 6. Had she been able to see the clock in the steeple, she would have seen that the time was midnight. She made herself ready for church, wearing her best dress. It was the only one she owned that was not tattered and patched. Walking into the street, she was chilled not only by the frigid air, but by the desolation of the village. Every house had disappeared into the shadows. The shops too, were missing, having vanished into obscurity. No light shone on the street or in the windows of buildings. Not a sound penetrated the void, not the squawk of a rooster, or even the call of a wolf from the distant forest. Though she was always alone, she now felt absolute separation from everything around her, the houses, the shops, the factories, and even from the hostility of the neighbors. Actually, this isolation was nearly a comfort to the aged mademoiselle, for it meant that on her way to church she would not have to bear up to the open malice of the villagers. As for the darkness, even blindfolded, dear old Marie would have been able to trudge to the St. Eulalie, without a single misstep. Walking faster than usual despite the cold and the snow, the spinster traversed Lonely Street, and marched onto La Rue Nonne, the Nuns' Street. 10 minutes later, she fairly leapt over a snow bank, and landed on the Rue de la Paroisse, the parish road. At the end of her sight line, the void was split open by a radiant brightness. Moving closer, she discovered the illumination was emanating from the open doors of the church. Spread wide, the doors revealed the inside of the church. It was entirely full, almost. Every single seat but one was taken. She did not recognize anyone among the hundreds filling the straight-backed wooden benches. They looked at her from the pews, but not with the expected scorn or revulsion. She took the only seat remaining, in the row nearest the altar rail. She noticed that every man and every woman in St. Eulalie's was dressed elegantly, but in the style of a half-century before. The cleric entered the altar from a side room, and though he began the service, the pervasive hush continued. The priest spoke the Mass, but no sound came from his mouth. Above, she could see the church bells moving, but their ringing was silent. Marie Chabot was well acquainted with every priest in the parish, but the white-bearded father mutely leading the prayers was a stranger. Every altar boy in Bordeaux at one time or another had taunted Marie, and called her a witch, but the two youths assisting at this eerie service were unfamiliar. She was certain she had never seen them before. Every pair of eyes but one was focused on the priest preaching his sermon from soundless lips. The drifting eyes belonged to a handsome young man in the full uniform of an officer of the French Legion of Honor. Marie felt those moving eyes. They were staring at her. She could feel them as they bore in on her. Wandering up her thin frame, they stopped momentarily at her waist, before moving on upwards where they stopped at her face, as if obsessed with her looks. The eyes were like strong magnets. Marie was compelled to turn her head and look at the face from which shined those forceful, penetrating orbs. Instantly she knew that it was her love, the warrior Georges Chasseau, who had fallen in battle a half-century ago. But now, he was alive and merely one pew distant. Certain she was, that the soldier lived, and that it was George. The small heart-shaped mark on the man's forehead above his left eyebrow could belong to no other person than her fiancé. His uniform was identical to the one he wore 50 years prior, on the night when he proposed marriage to Marie. One more battle he had to wage, he informed her, and then he would have his annual leave, and they would be wed. They shared that one night together, before Georges went off to war, and she went back home. During a siege in some distant land, he attempted to rescue 6 members of his command, who were being held prisoner in a farmhouse. All by himself he charged the building. Entering through a cellar window, he engaged the enemies and overpowered all but one. Though he perished in the skirmish, the others escaped, and the information they held eventually resulted in complete victory for the Legion of Honor. As she looked at him, the Knight of the Legion smiled at her with a full set of youthful, glistening teeth. George is alive, and still young, Marie thought, and nearly swooned.
Georges Chasseau? Is it really you? I loved you, George, and gave you the one thing a girl saves, for only the most special man on earth. I've never given that gift again. Not once in the 50 years that you've been gone. I've spent my life living many regrets. But, even under penalty of mortal sin, I do not apologize for our love. It was so strong, that it helped me get through the 18,000 miserable nights since we parted. Though I am old, and all about me has become dim, my love for you still shines just as bright as the sun.
Marie felt giddy. A wave of dizziness nearly swept her from her seat. George leapt over the pew and sat beside her. She leaned against him and closed her eyes. The frail old woman gained strength from the vibrant young soldier.
George? Who are these people in the church? I come here every day. But, I don't know any of them.
They're people from the place where I now live. They are friends, Marie. They have come here tonight because the time for our wedding has finally come.
Old and wasted as I am, I cannot marry you now, George. I'm ready now for death, dear, not for love. I would happily die this instant if I could match your youth, and once again give you my love.
Dear Marie, I love you still. Always. You will be young and lovely to me. Quiet now, they are collecting the offerings for this special midnight mass. Old men with long beards, from the back of the church came toward the pews, with long poles that had baskets attached to the ends. People began placing money in the baskets, as the elderly collectors pushed the poles in front of them. Every single parishioner dropped coins or bills into the receptacle, except Marie Chabot. The dear old lady had no money. She had nothing of value, except her ring, that wonderful gift from George, 50 years before. As the coins and bills were dropped into the collection basket, there was still not a sound in the church, except for the conversation between George, the young lover, and Marie, the withered old maid. Marie looked at the basket being held before her. It contained many bills and a pile of coins. She arrived at a decision. It was a hard choice, but one she willingly made. Slipping the tiny clasped hand's engagement ring from her finger, she dropped it in with the other offerings. Breaking the silence with a shockwave of vibration and sound, the bells overhead clanged so loudly they could be heard 5 miles distant. The people in the pews, who had been mute, began shouting loud congratulations to Marie, who was now standing next to the young soldier, who secured his arm around her narrow shoulders. In less than a second, everything disappeared into darkness. Gone was the church, the parishioners, the altar boys, the priest, and the gallant soldier, George Chassot. Gone too, was the once beautiful, now faded, old lady, Mademoiselle Marie Chabot. In the morning the landlord, who lived in an apartment on the bottom floor of the brick house, climbed the stairs to the turret at top of the house, and knocked on Marie's door. He banged on the portal 40 times yelling,
"I know you're in there. Open up, you old hag. Open the door. It's rent day. Come on now, open this door."
Still getting no response, he used his key, and went inside, where he found Marie Chabot dead in her bed, with a great smile upon her face. The greedy old landholder noticed something else. Marie's stringy white hair was gone. The old lady's face still carried the wrinkles of 7 decades, but her hair was thick, abundant, and the color of a golden sunset. Meanwhile, during the 6 o'clock morning mass at St. Eulalie, one of the old gentlemen who passed the baskets for offerings noticed something shiny, in what should have been an empty receptacle. Putting on his glasses, he peered into the collection basket and shouted in surprise,
"Why, there's a tiny gold band in the basket. It's an engagement ring, with 2 miniature clasped hands at the top of the ring."
And so closes Midnight Madness, the story of Marie Chabot. Was it midnight madness? Or was it a midnight miracle? We leave it to you, dear listener, to decide. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed our little production, please like it, tell somebody else about it, and come back to this channel soon for another visit.